Hello, welcome to the Business Connectivity Services for Office 365 webinar. My name is Thomas Nichols. I am the CTO of Eastridge Technology and a SharePoint architect. I'm also a Microsoft Virtual Technology Specialist for the BizTalk platform, specializing on integration services. In this webinar, we will be discussing the role of Business Connectivity Services, or BCS. We will show how to surface line of business data using Windows Communication Framework, or WCF, and web services. I will then demonstrate how to create BCS external content types, or ECTs, and an associated SharePoint external list. I will also demonstrate how to consume external content types using BCS web parts and the popular SharePoint 2010 chart web part. Business Connectivity Services, in a nutshell, is SharePoint 2010's out-of-the-box integration service for servicing external data. The BCS extends SharePoint's 2007 Business Data Catalog services. However, with BCS and SharePoint Designer 2010, it is much easier to create, manage, secure, and consume external data than it was in SharePoint 2007's Business Data Catalog. Also, in addition to the read capabilities that the BDC had in SharePoint 2007, BCS now allows out-of-the-box support for creating, updating, and deleting external data. Business Connectivity Services uses a BDC runtime to connect to backend systems using connectors. BCS connectors include Windows Communication Framework, or WCF connectors, database connectors to SQL Server, and .NET assemblies for object model-based connectors. Custom connectors can also be developed using Visual Studio. However, the Office 365 version of BCS currently only supports WCF connections to Internet-facing web services. Also, the Secure Store could be used for accessing WCF services or web services in a secured fashion. Through the WCF connector, you can access lots of line of business systems inside organizations like SAP, Oracle, Siebel, other CRM systems, or custom back-end data solutions. What is an external content type? External content types are basically the gateway to the external data. The ECT defines the data that is exposed, the allowed operations on that data, and the connection information used to access and update the data. External content types also have associations or relationships to other external content types. Let's go ahead and take a look at how you would develop a Windows Communication Framework service to access line of business systems. You would use Visual Studio primarily for the WCF service development. You could also use any standard web service definition to access data in your ECT, in your backend system through the ECT. So you basically go to Visual Studio, you create a WCF service application. In this case, I call it the store service, and we create the application. I'll go into Visual Studio and show you the contract. And with a WCF service, you have your service contract that defines the operations that are basically surfaced in the ECT, and the data contract defines the data members of that. So in this case, SharePoint ECTs need to have at least two reader operations. One is read list and the other is read item. The read list operation is used to return all stores that you would like to service in SharePoint. So it could be all active stores, it could be all your stores, it could be all stores for a particular region. But the idea there is to return all stores in some sort of list to the ECT. In this case, we have a list of store types, which are defined here. In SharePoint 2007 Business Data Catalog, this read list operation was called a binder method. The next method that we would need is the read item operation. The read item operation is basically the ECT's read operation that is used to basically return a single store entity to SharePoint. So you would get store by ID or some sort of identifier that would uniquely identify that store. If we look at the implementations of these service methods, we have the list of stores returned by getAllStores, and we have the individual store returned by the getStoreById. Let's go ahead and crack this open and take a look at the contents of this method. First off, we define a list of stores. We then iterate through this list of stores to return 5 stores for this example. Now, what you would normally do is connect this to back-end data, like a database or an API to CRM or Siebel or some other line of business systems. Just for this demo, I've just had it create the data inside the web service itself and just quickly return that information. And I've iterated over a loop here and created 5 stores. I set the ID to the iterator for the store. I set the store name to a formatted field, which is the store and then the ID itself. I'll convert for the store number a 0 field padded string that has the ID in it. The set store data is another little method I have here that simply sets, let me go ahead and show you that method. All it does is, given an ID, it'll actually assign the store a fictitious address and then sales number information that could come from a financial system, for example. So we have the store here getting its information back. I also have another method called the getStoreById method. You pass in the ID, it will then return basically the same ID back and set the store information for that as well. Also notice that I'm actually returning a random phone number for both the getItemID and the getAllStores. So this random number basically is going to produce a random phone number each time the web method is called, so that we can see inside of SharePoint when this method is called. I'll go ahead and debug this to show you the operations of the WCF service. Here I have the getAllStores and the getAllStoresById. In this case, I'll do select getAllStores. I'll invoke that method. No parameters are needed for this particular method. So I've returned 5 stores, 0 index, 0 through 4. So we have our first store, store number 1. Here's the address, and here's our random phone number, 502 area code. I'll invoke it again and again, and you should see that store phone number change on every invoke. Likewise, we have getStoreById. Here's a store number here. I'll select store number 1. I'll invoke that. If I make subsequent invokes, you'll see the store phone number changing as well on every call, changing store to 2, to 3, to 4, and again, a random phone number on every single invoke. I've also created a web service that implements the same type of functionality, and I have it here and deployed to our dev server. So here I am actually calling the store service. I have a getAllStores and getAllStoresById. Here's the getAllStores and the store by ID. I can also look at the service description for it, which is the web service description language. And here's that, web service description. Next, we want to deploy or actually use this web service as a connection to an external content type in business connectivity services. SharePoint Online doesn't really have you don't really have access to the central admin web application or the on-prem central administration site. In this case, you have Administration Center for SharePoint Online. I can manage site collections inside of my SharePoint Online site. Here I've created one called BCS Demo, a site collection here. I can also go to Business Data Connectivity and see all the external content types defined in my metadata store. In this case, I have none yet. I also have secure store services that could be used to access web services, for an example, that are secured. My example here, I'm allowing anonymous access to the web service. Not ideal by any means, but for development and for display, this should be okay. So I'll go back to site collections here. If I go to the BCS demo home site here, this is just an out-of-the-box SharePoint Online team site. If I want to create an external content type for use inside of this site definition, I would select Site Actions and edit SharePoint Designer. Clicking Edit SharePoint Designer. It's now going to basically open up SharePoint Designer and bind it to the VCS demo site that we have here. Next, I will click on External Content Types. And this is much the same way as you would develop an external content type for on-premise SharePoint solutions. So basically, it's the exact same whether it's in the cloud or on-premise. So I will select External Content Type here to create a new one. In this case, it's going to be obviously created in the Office 365 cloud. So I'll go ahead and click here to name my external content type. I'll call this one Line of Business Store. You can also have a different display name. I'll just go ahead and use the same as the ECT name. And then I actually have to define external system in which to bind this external content type to. I can click here to define the external data source, or I can click Operation Design View. Gets me to the same spot. Here I want to go ahead and add a connection to the web service. Now, when I click Add Connection, I have the three options: .NET, SQL Server, or WCF. Currently, SharePoint Online, or SharePoint Office 365, only allows access to WCF services. I'll select OK. The first parameter I'll need to give it is the web service description language for getting the metadata. I'll specify that it is WSDL. If it's using WCF, I can connect to a WCF service using metadata exchange. In this example, I'll just use WSDL. I'll then actually connect to the actual endpoint of the URL, which is not the WSDL. It's just simply that. I will name this connection Store Service. And because I'm basically anonymous, I don't need to specify anything other than just to connect to the web service using the identity of the user that's using SharePoint. I could also connect with impersonating a Windows identity from the Secure Store or a custom identity through the Secure Store. In this case, I'll go ahead and select default options of identity and just use the same for the metadata retrieval. Click OK. Now, SharePoint Online is going to go ahead and connect out to the web service, query that WSDL, and come up with the exposed web methods. Now, while that's doing that, I'll point out over here some warnings here that SharePoint Designer is going to basically need to complete an ECT creation. One, we have to have a read list operation, which is the get all, if you will. And then we have the read item method this operation must also be defined, which is the get item operation. So I'll go over here to the store service. This is the web method that we exposed, or the web service we exposed that had these two methods, get all stores and get store ID. The first operation I'd like to create is the read list. So I'll select the method, right click, and I'll do create read list operation. That will basically, SharePoint Designer will now open up a wizard that will allow me to step through the creation of this particular operation. In this case, it's the read list. I'm using the get all stores method. I'll select next. There are no input parameters required, though it could be things like filters of only active stores or whatnot, but this does not have any input methods to this particular method. On the return parameter, all I need to do is simply specify which of the fields are the identifiers, and is the identifier field, and select Map to Identifier. I then need to really select fields that will be used in picker controls when SharePoint users try to access a particular or search for a particular store. I'll select the ID itself, and I'll also select the store name as displayed in the picker as well. I'll then click Finish, and that will now save and create the Get All Stores read list operation. Now we need one other, which is the read item. That's given to us by the Get Store by ID. I'll right click on Get Store by ID and create a new read item operation. Again, the wizard will launch and allow me to step through creating that read item operation. Here's the web method we're using for that, get store by ID. It does have an input parameter, which is a store ID, so we'll make that the identifier method. I'll then select next, and we'll return all these additional fields from this. Now this could be separate or more information that's used in the get all, if you will. So the list might just show a dozen fields or less, and then the item might show all the items or all the fields that are being used when you click sort of a details view or when you open up the item in particular. You can also select a field here to map back to the identifier here. I can also go in and potentially change the display name to have a space in it, or if the field names are kind of obscure, then I can actually make them to a more of a friendly friendly user type display name. I'll go ahead and select the defaults in this case and click Finish. I now have a read list and read item, so I'm now satisfied the minimum requirements for the ECT. I'll go ahead and go into SharePoint Designer and click Save. This will now save the external content type back to the SharePoint Online Business Data Connectivity Metadata Store, which will basically define the ECT in SharePoint. I'll then go back to external content types, and now I can see the line of business store that I created using a WCF connector, and here's the external system that we defined for it, the store service. I can export this model if I'd like to. I can also edit the content type, which I can do by clicking here. The first thing I'd like to do with this external content type is create a list in SharePoint. Now, SharePoint has custom lists. They have document libraries, calendars, task lists, and several different types of lists that are available inside of SharePoint. But if I create a list from an external content type, it's referred to as an external list. I'll create this list. So here's the new external list, and I'll just call this one LOD Stores. I can put a list description on there if I'd like to. I can optionally also allow me to modify data using info path as well by clicking this. But for this example, I'll just simply create an external list. I'll click OK, and it's going to create SharePoint, the line of business stores external list. Okay, I can also see now that this ECT does have the line of business stores external list associated with it, these two operations and these fields. I'll go back into SharePoint Management here under the Administration Center here. I'll go to Business Data Connectivity, and I should now see that I've created a line of business store, the version 1, the external system stores here, and then the namespace for this. So here's the store. If I click on the line of business store, the entity here, I can see certain associations with it are unknown at this time, any custom actions we have, or any filters. I can also, of course, see the fields that I have for this and their type. So if I go into SharePoint itself, I'm back in the to the SharePoint Online Service. I'm going to hit F5 to go ahead and refresh this, and I now will see I have a line of business stores external list. It shows up as a standard SharePoint list. It is now querying my external web service and exposing the entries as list. Now, this list acts very much like a normal custom list. I can select on this, and I have the ability to interact with it on the ribbon. I've selected the store here for an example, and I have the view item. Notice, however, I do not have a create opportunity, so let me uncheck this. I don't have the ability to create new items. I also, when I click this, don't have the ability to edit the item or delete the item because those operations were not defined in the ECT. The only operations we had in the ECT were viewing the item, which is the get, and actually all the items here. So if I actually select view item here, it will now call the get store by ID method. Notice the store phone number has an area code of 623. I'll then close this, and I'll click view item again. I now have 645. I'll close it and redo it, and we have 242. What I wanted to illustrate there was the BCS system does not actually cache the connections to the ECT or the data returned from the ECT. So I actually requery this list here. You'll notice here the phone number 110 at the top. I'll just requery the list again. And we have a whole list of new phone numbers being randomized by the web service. So this is all live connections to the backend store. View item here again, that is a live call to the Windows service. Some things to point out, I can go in and actually filter. So these are all able to be filtered in this list. I can also go to the list, and let's say I wanted to remove this raw field on the far right and just use the actual formatted field here. I can go into Modify View, and I can remove the raw value here for an example, maybe even the store number. Click OK. So we can work with the list this way like we would any other normal list. One exception to keep in mind with external lists is that they do not support workflow. So I cannot create workflows or associate workflows with ECT types. Let's go back and look at the home page here and look at other ways we can surface data inside of SharePoint Online using ECTs and BCS. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and edit this page. This is a standard wiki page here inside of SharePoint Online. I'll go ahead and go to the text layout here, and I'll go ahead and give us 2 columns of the header. I'll go ahead and move this header back up. And what I'd like to do is basically add a web part to the page to expose that external content. I'll go ahead and click Insert and select More Web Parts. I then select under the categories Business Data, and I can work with Business Data catalog information this way. I can look at a particular item in the BCS. I could actually look at a list. I can look at related information in a list. I can even use Item Builder, which allows me to pass in information to external content type web parts so that I can filter if I wanted to down to certain values. What I'll select in this case is just the business data list to expose all the store information on the home page and click Add. Once I've added the web part to the page, I'll go ahead and click Edit Web Parts. And then I can basically bind this business data catalog web part to an ECT. I'll go ahead and select the ECT picker. Here I've actually selected the single line of business store external content type that we have to find. It'll automatically default me to the single view that we have, which is the read list view. I can also change other information about this web part like I normally would any other web part. Like, for example, the name of the web part. I'll just call this one Stores. I'll then click OK. If I save and close this page, I can now see the data being displayed not in a list but in a web part to users so they can see this information. I can also at any time go into this view itself and click Edit View, and I can basically hide and show information that returned from the ECT. So I could elect here not to show the raw data here again and not show the address, for example, and then click OK. So we can control some of the information that's being returned from the ECT. Another business data catalog web part that we might want to use would be to display just a single ECT item. So I'll go ahead and edit this page. I'll go ahead and delete this web part. I'll add a new web part by clicking Insert, More Web Parts. And in this case, instead of a business data list, I'll just select a business data item and click Add. Again, I'll go ahead and edit the web part and pick the ECT from the picker control. Same ECT. I now have an additional property here in the web part. I'll select the item. In this case, I'll do Item 1 and click OK. This will be used to display just a single ECT element, in this case, store number 1. I can also add an additional web part in BCS that allows me to pass in using a query string the store ID. So in this case, I'll do More Web Parts. I'll use the connectivity filter in this case. Click Add. I will then take this web part and basically actually that's not the web part I wanted to use. The web part I want to use in this case would be under Insert. Instead of a filter operation, which you could use for the Get All, the business data option here I want to use would be the item builder versus the filter. So the item builder here is what we want to use. And really all I want to do there is just basically wire it up so that this will send information to the line of business store web part we have here. And it would work something like this. Let me go ahead and save and close. I can go to the home page here and basically specify store ID equal 1. And it will now pass store ID 1 to the web part, to 3 in this case, and we'll get store ID 3. I'll go ahead and edit this web part page again. I'm going to delete this web part. Let me go ahead and save and close this and reopen the page. So let me go ahead and edit this page. Go ahead and delete this web part. And the next thing I'd like to show you is the chart web part. That's another way we can surface data. So in the business data, we'll select the chart web part. This is a very popular web part for displaying data inside of SharePoint. So I'll click Add. I'll then go ahead and save and close this. We now have our chart part on the page. I'll go ahead and click Data and Appearance. I can connect the chart to data. Now, we have a couple of options. We can connect it to another web part from an external list or a business data catalog or Excel. I'll go ahead and select the external content type list that we created as an external list. So I'll connect this to a list. I'll select Next. I'll use the line of business stores external list on this site. I then get confirmation that that is indeed the external content type we'd like to surface in this control. Now in this chart, I'd like to actually show, instead of the BCS identity here, I'd like to show the raw sales number information. Other fields I like to do for the tooltip, I'd like to show the store name. And for the label, I'll just go ahead and use the formatted sales information and click Finish. This will bind the chart to the external list. If I click Data and Appearance, I can also customize the chart to have many, many different types of chart options out of the box. I can have a bar, I can have a line, both two-dimensional and three-dimensional. I'll select pie chart. I have two-dimensional and three-dimensional versions of that. I'll select this pie chart here and click Next. I can then resize it if I'd like to maybe 400 by 400, make it a little bit larger. I can also change the theme, for an example, to a grayscale or a light steel blue, for an example. Then I can go ahead and click Next to get some more options. I can show the legend for this chart. And I can specify where I'd like the legend in the chart. I can also add a chart title. So let's say Store Sale. And click Finish. Now I have a chart web part that's actually pulling external content information into SharePoint. So we have web parts that can be used to surface information, both tabular type information using the out-of-the-box BCS web parts, or we can use the chart web part to give a very graphical view of that ECT information. I can also work with it as a list like I normally would. Also, some things to keep in mind is that the Business Data Catalog ECTs are completely searchable and crawlable, so I can actually crawl external content type. And so if I were to go to search and do a search for store number 2, I would be able to have that in my search results. Click on it, and I could open up the ECT and view that information from search. That's very nice. You can also create profile views for your external content type that will allow you to basically display it as a page, and you can pull in other information like PO information, other graphic information, things like that from your ECT. Another thing another common question I get with business connectivity services is what the method signature should be for your create, update, and delete operations. And so I wanted to kind of show you those. If I go back to Visual Studio where we define these two read methods, the other operations you'd want to create typically are your create, update, and delete operations. The create store would just basically take a new store, return a store. The update store just basically takes the new updated store information, doesn't have a return. The delete store, you just simply pass in the store ID and then you delete that service and or delete that store and then not return anything for those. These operations, once you expose those in your WCF, you can then go into SharePoint Designer and you would actually go in and add those operations here as update, create, and delete operations. You could also create new associations with other ECTs inside of an operation manager here. That completes our demonstration of SharePoint Online for the VCS and external content types. Let me give you some contact information here. Please follow us on Twitter, Eastridge Tech. You can also find us on Facebook at Eastridge Technology or on the web at eastridge.net. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.